go.
Awesome.
Terry, in the chat, can you let us know if people are coming in? Because we have no way of knowing that. Welcome, everybody. Get yourself comfortable and we'll wait for everybody to load into the room and we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Okay, we'll start in about 1 minute. Okay, why don't we get started? Good afternoon. Welcome to a resilient return to the classroom. I'm very, very excited about being the co-host of this webinar. It's being presented here by TLC Virtual Resiliency. I'm Dr. Paul Meller. I'm a psychologist. I've been doing work in prevention for about 32 years. I'm currently the Chief Innovation Officer at TLC Virtual Resiliency. I'm also the Director of Doctoral Training and School Psychology at Hofstra University. And I've been working with schools, Head Start, courts, other community agencies for well over 30 years. Developing, implementing, and evaluating programs to promote wellness for both children and the people who work with them. I'm thrilled to have with me my co-host, Dr. Nadine Castoro. Nadine, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Nadine Castoro. I am a psychologist at the elementary level over in a school in Long Island in Plainedge. I've been here for about 18 years and I am experiencing everything that you guys are experiencing as our attendees. And I'm looking forward to having this webinar with you to talk about some ways that we can handle some of the ever-changing problems that are going on in the world today. I have 2 children at home and I'm a parent. I am a cancer survivor and I am a wife. So between all of that, I am a well-rounded individual and looking forward to speaking with all of you today.
Thanks, Nadine. So why don't we just get started? Nadine, why don't you kick it off for us?
Okay, great. So let's talk about welcome back to the classroom. This is how I know many of my colleagues are feeling, if not all of them, with what's going on today. Our jobs have changed, and we're going to talk to you guys today about how we can work towards that more peaceful Zen type of resiliency we need to get back to. It's very hard. We understand we're living it, and we want to give you some tools and tips and talk a little bit about how we can address and bring ourselves back to a place of resiliency.
You know, being an educator is one of the most difficult jobs that that I can think of and that we're in the thralls of. And oftentimes the schools are just this absolute sea of ongoing crisis. When we think about a crisis and level of stress of something like the pandemic, sometimes it feels like a tidal wave and it's just crushing us. So many pieces, so difficult, so many solutions that just aren't available. The problem with working in the schools is that this is just one of a whole slew of crises that we've been facing over the years. And more often than not, the crises in schools aren't these gigantic tidal waves, but it's one crisis after another, after another, after another. And not only do we face the same kinds of crises again and again, they tend not to resolve themselves. So Nadine, some of the crises that you've seen as a school psychologist?
Well, I mean, it started, we can go way back. Where we talking about the internet and cyberbullying and how we can address cyberbullying. And then the cyberbullying turned into school shootings and how we're going to prevent school shootings and practicing lockdowns. And then, now we have COVID and what we can do with the pandemic and the masks and not the masks and who's vaccinated, the testing mandates to see if we are. It's overcrowded. Teachers are devalued. You guys are heroes. Look at everything that you guys are trying to do. And unfortunately, you're getting a lot of pushback because there's so much and our levels are just increasing so much. And we're at our point of burnout.
Right. And if you can see from this little graph, people who work in the schools, teachers see themselves as work being stressful, either always, often, or sometimes more than 90% of the time. This is just those rolling waves. They don't go away.
So lack of respect for educators. And what's happening is that if you look at this little chart over here, what teachers have reported is that they're treated with respect by the administration or by parents. So often now, I mean, how many times have you dealt with that phone call from that parent who devalued you or had a lack of respect? And it's not just from the parents, it's from the school board, it's coming from the administration, it's coming from the federal elected representatives who are having laws and rules, and we don't know which rules to follow at this point. There's just so much that's coming, and there's a lack of respect, especially from our students alone. The respect for us as educators is just really not present as much as it used to be years ago.
Right. And, we're seeing this at all different levels. So we saw what went on just this past week in Chicago with the conflict between the teachers in Chicago and the school board and the city. Jess, I see that you're in California and that Los Angeles is really facing the same kinds of issues again and again and again, where teachers aren't consulted on how to roll back, how to stay safe, how to educate children who've been out, creating all sorts of conflict. And the people who are there on the front line, you as educators, are often the last people to be consulted with, if at all, really showing that lack of respect. And that just wears us down again and again and again. So we also have to worry about COVID-related stressors. And not only do we worry about our own illness, but we worry about, safety for others and safety for the people we work with. We worry about the safety for, the kids that we're working with. Technology issues. Okay, we're 2.5 years into it. Most of us kind of know how to get into Zoom, might have a Google Meet under your belt or two. And some of you who are really advanced might even know how to use Cisco until you don't, and it goes wrong. And all of a sudden, there's no image, or that you're teaching a hybrid class. And while you might have the technology up, how do you fully engage? Half your class there, half of your class not there. The technology issues have been just dramatic over the last couple of years. Also, ambiguous and changing rules. How much do you have to quarantine? Is it 5 days? Is it 10 days? Ambiguous rules. The most recent CDC rules are hugely ambiguous. 5 days after your symptoms start subsiding. I don't know what that means. Does that mean I'm about to go into the hospital and 5 days later, I still can't breathe, but I can lay in bed? I'm better. Does that mean I have to go back and my union's not going to support me if I don't because my symptoms are getting better? But that's the CDC guidelines. So we don't know how to implement these, and we're getting very, very bad guidance. From the federal level, it's just too ambiguous. And oftentimes the local level has very, very different kinds of agendas going on, making those rules very, very confusing for all of us. We also have to worry about the lost education and development time. Children coming back after being out of the classroom for 3 years or 2.5 years, and now coming back, acting as the way they left. So that we have ninth graders coming in who are acting like sixth graders. Ninth graders and sixth graders aren't the same creatures, but the sixth graders haven't learned to be ninth graders yet. Plus, there's concerns about how much of the curriculum they haven't really grabbed onto during that time. One important issue, and Nadine, I'm going to punt this over to you because I know that you confront this every single day, and that's tribalism inside the school buildings.
And that's how everybody's getting along. I mean, we see such a divide that has been taking place within the buildings. Who is for vaccines, who's against vaccines. The conversations are no longer about the family or what's going on in their day-to-day dealings. Our conversations now are focused and hyper-focused on what's going on in the political climate and what's going on with vaccines and how to deal with certain things that, unfortunately, there's a divide that a lot of us are facing. People are no longer eating in lunchrooms. There's that fear that's going on. Grade levels are no longer congregating to talk with one another because of different viewpoints or whether or not they wear masks when they're together or not together. So you've got this whole group of people that no longer are supporting one another. In essence, we're kind of isolating ourselves because we need to work, and that's a big stressor because we don't have anyone, or they don't have anybody to turn to anymore.
Sure. And it completely changes the structure of the school. In the past, we would have, primary grade teachers as a cluster. You might have fourth grade teachers as a cluster. You might have sixth grade. You might have regular ed and gen ed as clusters that share with each other and become part of it. PPS might be a cluster that's a little bit different than the high school than, let's say, social studies teachers, or a different cluster than the phys ed teachers. Now we have tribalistic clusters. Are you a masker or you are anti-masker? Are you a vaxxer or you are an anti-vaxxer? And what it's doing is it's changing the whole dynamic inside school buildings and elevating the level of stress because nobody knows who they can talk to about what. And people are bringing up topics that are making other people feel uncomfortable, but don't necessarily have to be addressed in the school. The day-to-day school issues tend to be put aside. And more important, the interpersonal connections that we've had before seem to be put aside as to what team are you on? What tribe are you on? And that gives you entry into that group, or it kicks you out of it. A huge stressor, among many other things. Okay, so I have a poll question. We're going to do a bunch of these throughout today. So let me pull up my poll question, if I can. Okay. Talk about technology issues. There it is. I'm not getting my little screen up. So here's the poll.
I don't know. I need my intern, Paul. Those are the ones that help me with the technology.
I know. I'm getting a little old to be able to do this. So question one, what's been the most significant stressors for you that you faced during the school year? Okay.
So if you guys can just click. Great.
Oh, we can't vote.
It's like election night. We're waiting for the polls to close. Okay, I'll give this like another 10 seconds for the poll to close, and then we can chat about it. Okay, there's more votes coming in.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so at 40%, just the uncertainty of the situation is the number one stressor that people have been facing. Number two, with 30% of you marking it, is the added demands in the classroom, including Nadine's term here, being the mask police. Number 3 and 4 and 5 tied. Kids lost education time. No, kids lost education time is falling behind a little bit here. Parents not following guidelines and others. So we see across all of you that some of these are more important than others. But what I'm looking at here, despite that the added demands and kids lost education time are at the top of this, there's really a full distribution of these types of stresses, really meaning that everybody's feeling everything.
And Paul, I'm reading some of the comments as you're speaking, and I see some people who are commenting on this poll, and just to kind of draw attention, a lot of people are saying all of the above because in reality,
right.
There's not one single stressor this year that they're faced with. It's really just everything. And then everything on top of it contributes to the level of burnout that they are feeling in the classroom. You also have somebody that indicated, mask police. It's not so much us being mask police, but, there's oftentimes, the parents that don't send them in with the masks, or you don't feel comfortable and you don't agree with it. And then you're asking a child. So it goes against your own views. There's a lot here. So I think everyone's kind of feeling, for the most part, the technology issues kind of fallen by the wayside here, because I think we've been asked to do this for 3 years now, that's really not the biggest stressor at this point.
Right. And Dwight, I appreciate your comment, not just about the mask police, but the issue about parents and parents following rules and guidelines, making it so much more difficult for all of us to do our jobs. Okay. And hooray to the parents that actually help. That's a great thing. And then, other people who just march by their own drummer. Okay. So what happens with all of these stressors? I like to think about these as having a sore foot. I'm sure each and every one in this room has had a time that they've twisted their ankle, they've rolled their ankle, it turned ugly and purple, you can barely walk, getting a sock on hurt, you certainly have trouble putting a shoe on. And when your foot is that sore, even just touching it gently with your finger or putting a sock on hurts a lot. On the other hand, if your foot is healthy and you don't have a sore, ankle, then you can poke yourself all day long and you don't even think about it. Those rolling waves of stressors that just hit you again and again and again, school shooting, cyberbullying, bullying, teen pregnancy for those of you who are in the high school, helicopter parents, disengaged parents, substance use, again and again and again. Changing standards, changing assessment strategies, again and again and again. And the problem in the schools is that we get hit with these new stressors and we don't resolve the old ones. They're still there. So it's one on top of another. So being educators, we're all facing the situation where we all have emotional and professional sprained ankles. And every small stressor that hits us that much harder than it would otherwise, because it's just piled on to all of the other stresses from before.
We're not having resolution. There's no resolution that's taking place. So what's happening is that there's no end, and then another thing is added on, and then another thing is added on, and it's too much.
And what we see coming out of that is really high rates of teachers who can be identified with symptoms consistent, especially with depression. About 27% of all teachers experience signs of anxiety and anxiety disorders. 37% of educators feeling anxious. This is a big one, and we're going to come back to it again and again. In the current year, 53% of teachers are thinking about leaving the profession. Okay. And that's far more than ever before. Since the pandemic, we've seen an almost 20% increase in alcohol and substance use, among teachers, trying to cope in sometimes less than adaptive ways.
So what I'm seeing, and just to kind of draw a little example, I teach for the teacher center here over in my district, and it's new teachers. And when we have new teacher, and usually I have about 5 new teachers a year, 6 new teachers, and we teach to them. Yesterday, I had 36 new teachers, and these are new tenure track positions of teachers because last year we had a big influx of teachers whose stress levels have gotten to a point where they were ready for retirement and they took the incentive or they went because at this point, it's not the benefit of them staying is going to elevate their stress levels that they're ready to go. So when they're eligible to leave, or even if they're not eligible to leave, they're willing to take that percentage of possible against their retirement because the teaching profession is just getting much more difficult, and we're losing some very strong veteran teachers. Technology in general is very difficult. I find it very difficult to navigate some of the technology that's new, and I know that they do as well. But you're finding that 3 in 10 members are leaving a little sooner and finding other careers or just kind of spending time with their family because it's getting to a point where the stress is so much that the benefit of actually working a full-time job in the schools is not worth it to them anymore. And education is not what it used to be. And it's shifted and it's changed, just like any other profession changes. But for this, we are the forefront, and a lot of fingers are pointed to us, and we get a lot of the blame. And unfortunately, it's leading to a lot of educators leaving our profession early.
And that's a huge problem, not just because we're losing educators, but if you think that in in the past, we lost about 50% of all educators in the first 7 years of their career for a variety of reasons, and now put 30% on top of that, so that we're losing another total of 15%. We're really losing 65% of people. Plus, we're losing the people who are more trained and more seasoned, who are masterful teachers and other school professionals who can train and bring up the other people. And they're not there anymore either.
And I wonder how many of you are facing the same difficulties that we're facing here on Long Island with substitute coverage. I have many teachers who are special areas and math specialists and physical education teachers who are covering classes. So they're trained art teachers and trained music teachers, but they're not teaching music. They're teaching 3rd grade or they're teaching 6th grade because the teachers can't come to school because of the rules of quarantine, or that they're sick, or there's somebody in their family is sick, and they're not doing what they were trained to be doing. And that's, again, another stress. We're not doing the job that we once were taught and loved so much. And this was at one point, this was one of the most difficult professions to get yourself into, and now there are a lot of jobs that will be open at the end of this year.
Absolutely. And Dwight, hats off to you. The next slide was actually going to talk about the Rand Corporation report, but we decided for time that we can pull it out. But I'm glad that you brought it up in the chat. It's great. And I think that everybody needs to read that report because it's scary. So Nadine, you want to talk about other kinds of stressors?
Yes. So, again, just speaking for myself, I have children at home and a spouse at home, and the difficulty with balancing work and home life is a significant stressor for myself in the education field. I find that what's happening is my own children are feeling it. So trying to get home, or if they're quarantining, I find myself and many other teachers forced to leave their children home at an earlier age than we normally would have because of quarantine rules, but we need to go to work. So not only are we doing our job from our school day, we're now going home to get onto the computer and the Google Classroom to do the work of our child because they're not getting the education that they need. And these demands, it's very difficult. I mean, if you look, it's very difficult across the board, from kindergarten to 12th, educators are reporting that they're having an extremely difficult time balancing these demands. And again, taking care of children or taking care of sick parents and taking care of, relatives of ourselves or worrying about relatives. It's a lot. So not only are we parentified in the school now, and have we become parents to so many of our own students, we are now working to support our own children in the educational realm that are so often either home or dealing with some of the stress that's going on. And, the mental health status of them too. We find that they're suffering, our own children and our own spouses are suffering, we're suffering, and then in turn we just kind of create this dynamic where everybody in the house is suffering, and it's just a negative cycle that just kind of continues.
So let's talk a little bit about what we can do about all of this now that we hear about everything that's going on out there and that you're living and that you really not just understand, but feel, the negative effects of it on an ongoing basis. One of the issues that we at TLCBR really try to promote is the idea of resiliency. And I know that resiliency has fallen into some of this common terms. Everybody talks about being more resilient, but I really want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing and what resiliency really is for educators. So we have challenges all the time. We have stresses of everyday life. We have job stresses. We have our own traumas and stresses. We have tragedies. We have all sorts of crises. And resilience is about taking those stresses and allowing us to thrive, okay, despite all of those stresses, to bounce back, to rise up above them, to show flexibility in our adaptation, because sometimes the old way of getting through all of this isn't going to work. And ultimately, another phrase that's been thrown around a lot recently is the idea of post-traumatic growth. And resiliency is really about the ability to grow from the challenges. And that doesn't necessarily mean embracing it and saying, boy, I'm glad that I went through these challenges, but coming through the other side of those challenges, being able to better face those challenges and other challenges into the future. The good news is that resilience can actually be taught and learned. A lot of times people think about resilience in the same way they think about grit and perseverance, and that it's a personality trait or a characteristic. And that's not true. And in fact, it's not even true about grit. Grittiness can be trained and taught. Resilience can be taught, it can be learned, and it can be improved. Everybody, by practicing their own resilience, can become more resilient. The other thing is that not everybody is resilient in every facet of your life. Some people are really good at compartmentalizing. So when it comes to school-related stressors, they're key. They got it. They got it down. They got their classroom humming. They got their teachers very, very happy and working with them. They're working with their administrators. They're moving the kids ahead, educationally and developmentally, and then they get home. And then it doesn't quite work so well because all of the energy that they put in at school is now sapped, and there's not a whole lot at home. Nadine, I see you smiling knowingly.
I know. I always say I'm a much better psychologist than I am a parent because that's really the truth. Here I'm the crisis management. I'm very calm. I'm very flexible. I'm able to handle everything. As much as I believe, I very rarely feel agitated about anything, and I'm able to kind of get through many situations using a lot of the techniques that Paul will discuss with you in a little while. But I know that the patience for my children, and my spouse, when I'm on my way home and I call, no longer am I asking about their day. It's what homework do you have? What do you need to do? What are we having for dinner? It's quick to the point. We don't have the tolerance of the patience anymore.
And that's a good tip of the hand to something we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, and that's compassion fatigue. Just running out of the juice to feel compassionate to everybody, including ourselves. Before we get there, let's do another poll question, and let's see if I can actually pull up the poll again. And poll 2, and I'm going to launch it. So how do you define resilience in your own life?
So you guys can go ahead and just click on what you feel is your definition. There's no wrong answer here.
No, absolutely not. And once again, there can be multiple answers. We have it set up with your best answer, but we recognize that you could have clicked all 5.
Paul, I'm going to say this is probably also very influenced by age and where you are at stage in your life as well. As I look over these polls, I want to say that one stage in my life early on, I felt a certain way. And at this point in my life, I feel a different way. I think life experience and what we've gone through has definitely shifted your own definition of resiliency.
Absolutely. And I want everybody to take notice of the results of the poll, and see that most of you are doers, and it's conquering things and getting it done. And that's a characteristic of educators, because we give to other people. We have something that we have to do, and we get it done. The other pieces of feeling peace, contentment, feeling strong. Nobody thought maintaining an interpersonal connection, was all that important, or not feeling overwhelmed and not losing it. Those are all characteristics that reflect back on yourself. That's a characteristic of educators. It's a characteristic of a giver. And it's also a bit of a recipe for burnout. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. So just a couple of a quick look at some of the benefits of resiliency. First off, there's all those other stress-induced difficulties that are out there, including, we talked about depression. We're seeing dramatic increases in post-traumatic stress reactions in educators. And we're seeing two new kinds of stress reactions in educators that were there for some, but not nearly as many. And that's secondary traumas, that is, teachers feeling and educators feeling traumatized by watching other people go through traumas, so that they're not experiencing it directly, but that indirectly experience it by your coworkers, by the children, by the families that come to you with these very, very difficult scenarios that they raise to you, or that you had seen yourself firsthand from other people. That's a secondary trauma. And these kinds of traumas, especially COVID-related traumas, are something called a complex trauma. Some traumas, like getting hit by a car, you get hit by a car and then it's done. You've already been hit. Some traumas just go on and on and on, and they don't stop. And they repeat itself over time, again and again and again. Teachers have two tiers of secondary trauma that is absolutely difficult for them to manage with. One is the pandemic itself. The pandemic doesn't stop. It's not like, oh, it's Tuesday, today's pandemic day, I can't wait till Wednesday when it goes away. That's not happening. We're 2.5 years deep into the pandemic, and likely no end in immediate sight. Then we also have, remember those rolling waves and that sore ankle? Those are trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma. And those are complex traumas too. So we're seeing teachers and educators having far more complex trauma reactions than we've ever seen in the past. The really upside in building resiliency is that people who show more resiliency have greater life satisfaction, greater satisfaction in their relationships. And that's all relationships: relationship with their kids, relationship with their coworkers, relationship with their significant other, relationship with the system that they work with, greater satisfaction in their career. When you have that, you're able to find your peace, you find your joy. You're not spending as much time trying to cope and more time doing it. So people report that they're just enjoying life that much more. Okay. And generally speaking, people who show high levels of resilience tend to be happier. They report themselves to be more fulfilled, and they report themselves to feel that their roles in the world, whether or not it's as a parent, as a teacher, as a coach, as a member of a church or other religious organizations, that they feel that they're contributing in a meaningful way and that they have meaningful lives. Okay. I want to just talk a little bit about TLC's kind of approach to building resiliency. And we think about building resiliency in terms of a tree, and the tree has 4 zones: the fear zone, the learning zone, the growth zone, and the resilience zone. Now, one thing, if any of you have climbed a tree, you know that it's never straight to the top, and you know it's hard to get to the top. So you climb the tree, and you get halfway there and you look up and say, oh, I can't reach the next branch. So you have to kind of climb down and find another route up to get to that branch. And you might get there and all of a sudden the wind's shaking. So now you have to climb back down. And that's what happens in building resiliency. It's not one way, so that we have to keep practicing it and trying again and again and again. The bottom layer is where lots of people start off, and that's the fear zone. And during that fear zone, people feel disconnected. They feel isolated. That depression, that anxiety, worry, and anger really kick in, that there's no good adaptive way to cope with the stressors. So you feel stuck, and that leads to all of those negative responses to it. Once you learn a little bit about building resiliency, through coping strategies, through mindfulness and things like that, you jump up into the learning zone. In the learning zone, people feel more calm. They tend to be more present. And because they're learning new ways of understanding their stressors and where they're coming from, even if they haven't mastered them yet, they're more open-minded to try new things. And they're also more open-minded to start thinking about the situation in a slightly different way, reframing it so they can move up into the growth zone. Growth zone's a great place to be. Growth zone, you feel energized, you feel grateful and empathic because there's more of you to give, because there's less getting beaten down by those stresses in the previous zones. It also allows you to move forward slowly but surely to being generally more resilient. And people who hit that resilience zone at the top feel empowered, capable. And one of the nice things about being resilient at the top, just like climbing a tree, if you're climbing a tree with family, if you're climbing a tree with friends and you get to the top, well, generally what you do is you celebrate a little bit, but then you reach down to the people who are climbing behind you and you pull them up, and they become more resilient, and they pull other people up and they become more resilient, and they pull other people up. And geometrically, we create a resilient community. Okay. And yes, can a stressor knock you from being really resilient back down into the fear zone? Sure. But the good news about that is, even if you take a trip down the tree a little bit, you already know the path back up again. So you're able to get back into the resilient zone quicker.
All right, so let's talk about some of these factors that contribute to our resiliency, Paul.
Sure. And when we think about resiliency leading to well-being, we really conceptualize this having three columns or three pillars, always supported underneath by mindfulness. So one set of skills and capabilities that we see as critical in building resilience have to do with thoughts and self-thoughts. And we'll talk about each one of these one at a time in a second. Interpersonal connections, relationships, and communication. Forgiveness we'll talk about a lot. And then also mind-body connection and the physicality of being well, okay, and how not being well can actually draw us down. All of those are supported by enhanced mindfulness. Let's talk about these one at a time so we can really see there's a lot here. This is dense, so we'll break it down a little bit. I threw the slide in just because I like the trees. Okay, so thoughts and perceptions we put together, and some of the most important thoughts that we're talking about are right here. So Nadine, do you want to talk about a couple of these?
Yeah, it's how we believe about ourselves and the thoughts that we attribute to who we are and what defines who we are and what kind of person that we want to be. Sometimes that we are so focused on the negative or the negative thinking that we kind of find ourselves caught up in we're not good enough or we haven't been good enough. And this is more changing your thoughts to a more optimistic and a more positive type thought process. You need to be a little bit more, what we do here, or at least what we've started to do here, is so often another faculty meeting. And oh no, we got to sit now through another hour after work. We have so much stuff to do at home. We just spent the whole day dealing with this child who wouldn't keep their mask on and this parent who doesn't know whether or not their child should quarantine. We kind of put our names down, and this is one of our tools that we use here. And then we kind of go around and have all the staff members write something positive about the other people that they work with. Because so often we're focusing in on the negatives. And, I find myself doing that sometimes with my children and with, at home more so than at work. But we're focusing on, we're catching the child doing bad. We're catching ourselves. And then it translates into our own thoughts about ourselves and what we're not doing right.
Okay, and I'm going to actually jump ahead because you introduced something really good, and then I'm going to go back. And
Okay.
that's the whole notion of tootling. Okay, and tootling is focusing on the good. And just like Nadine was talking about in the faculty meeting, that you pull out a name and say that you've done something good. Tootling is a great way to refocus and recenter. It's the exact opposite of tattling. You know, you're catching somebody in a good moment. And I think tootling is one of the great ways to start your day, to refocus and put a positive lens on your day rather than go in and say, oh no, what's going to hit me today? So I'm going to practice a tootle right here, and I'm going to tootle my good friend and longtime colleague, Nadine. And Nadine, I just want to express my gratitude towards you for your willingness to participate in this, for putting in so much time and effort so that we can put this presentation forward, and that you're contributing so much to your profession and giving back by really doing this and being front centered. And it makes me feel wonderful and actually grateful to be part of this profession. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I want you also to think about the tootle time as something that we oftentimes tell teachers and educators, and you know this from practice, that if you're calling a parent, make sure that you start off with something positive before you go into some of the negatives, because what ends up happening is that the parent will only hear the negatives. So if you focus on the good and you try to, then you have more buy-in, and the parent's going to be more focused to kind of listening to you and kind of, respond and work collaboratively together. So even at CSE meetings and annual reviews, it's very important that we kind of share the positives sometimes, because oftentimes we focus on the negatives, and all parents and all teachers here are negative upon negative upon negative. It contributes to our burnout. But going back to that previous one about thoughts, Paul, I'm sorry that I jumped the gun with toodles, but
Nope, that's okay.
touch base a little bit about communication as well. And that kind of falls in here as far as, practicing gratitude and being thankful about certain things. Oftentimes we've lost that because we can't imagine something positive happening in this ever-changing world, because there's so much negativity that is going on. You go home and you have, or at least myself, I know I have that hour to myself. I turn on the news, and what is it? More negativity and more things that are going on in the world, and more conflict and more political disputes. And it becomes very difficult for all of us. So for me, I find that if you focus on positives and you try to not let the negative world drown you out so much, you're able to kind of find that silver lining and yourself as well. And that's important.
And look how it plays itself out. And this poll strikes a chord with me because everybody I talk to about it has, not everybody, but most everybody has the same answer. So here's the poll. When you get home from work and someone asks you how your day was, how often do you reply focusing on good things versus bad things? Often point out the good things first, always mention the bad things first. Well, make sure you have a balance. Wow, we have actually a very it's pretty well balanced here. So
Well,
people are still responding.
I'm going to say they don't have 14-year-old attitude teenagers at home then, because, the cognizant value of knowing that you have to point out the good. And then as soon as you get home and you get that attitude, it goes right for the negative.
Absolutely. So let's just take a look at what the results look like. This is impressive, I have to say, that 46% of you are pointing out the good things first. Good for you, because what that does is it actually takes that lens, that gray lens of looking, at the world as something always is going to happen. What's happening next? And get rid of it. It peels it back. The people who have a balance, well, you're realists. Okay, I get that. And you know what? We're living through a pandemic. The people who are pointing out always mention the bad things first. You're venting, and you got to get that out, and that's important. However, if you start talking about the good things first, the power of those negative things and how much it affects you, you're going to find decrease a little bit. So you don't ignore the bad things, but if you put it into context of the good things, then it actually helps build far more stress resilience. So let's move on. And by the way, we're kind of pre-programmed to look at the bad. Our brains tell us, look at the bad, because that helps us survive. We're always looking for the next shoe to drop. And our hearts are always telling us to look at the good. So we have this internal tug of war between our brains and our hearts, looking at something good or looking at something not so good. So the next pillar that we were talking about are connections. So Nadine, you want to talk a little bit about connections?
I mean, connection is very important because a connection is what we kind of thrive on, is our relationships with others. It's who we go home to, or who we work with, or who we trust in, our friendships and our relationships. And so often what we're finding are people are isolating themselves because, of different political views, or different, again, like we spoke about before, different viewpoints and everything that's going on. And again, there's just so much burnout that another conversation with somebody else is just too much energy. So connections, it's really important because so many of our communications, and that's something I want to focus on, are anger filled. And we find ourselves driven by anger because not so much that we're angry at people, but we're just angry with what's going on and our overload. So if we send an email or we receive an email, we're short on time. A lot of these are misunderstood or miscommunicated, or, and sometimes the tone in the email may be misread. It's very important that we kind of make sure that our connections and who we're talking to are a little bit more positive, or at least kind of understanding that they're also going through what we're going through. And that leads into a little bit about forgiveness, if you want to speak about that.
Sure. And I want to, people misunderstand the idea of forgiveness. And as young kids, we're often taught forgiveness is about absolution. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Turn the other cheek, shake hands, and make up. Thing is that when people hurt us, it's really hard to forget. There's a great book out there. It's probably 25 years old now, How to Forgive When You Can't Forget. And that's really how a psychologist thinks about forgiveness. And forgiveness for a psychologist and in building resilience isn't about telling the other person it's okay, but it's about telling you that you don't have to add any more energy and any more emotional energy and any more thought process into being angry or hating the other person, because that takes up a lot of your time. It takes up a lot of your personal resources. It takes up a lot of your interpersonal, what you have to give to other people. So when you forgive, you're not forgiving to make the other person feel better, but you're forgiving so that you have more to give to your life, to yourself, and the people around you. It's actually a very, very self-centered kind of forgiveness. I'm going to forgive you so I can live a better life. It doesn't matter to me how it affects you. It matters how it affects me.
It's got a very freeing effect to you. So it kind of lightens your load a little bit. And it is selfish in that sense because you're kind of doing it for yourself. You're not doing it so much to assist the other person. And that's more talking about building yourself. Communication, in order to if you are an effective communicator and you're able to do that, then that contributes a lot to your resiliency. And working on the effective communication is really important to build that, and forgiveness and all of this is just essential to resiliency and resiliency building.
Okay. And I also want to talk a little bit, that we'll talk a little bit about physical factors and biological factors that relate back to building resiliency. For time, Nadine, I'm just going to pass this over to you than.
No problem. I'm going to just there's actually research out there that supports that there's an increase in, if you were to exercise or take care and healthy lifestyle, you're actually releasing feel-good endorphins, and you're actually increasing your serotonin levels. And, there's a gut health that really kind of works to kind of help you when you have a healthier lifestyle. That feeling inside, that sometimes we get with the anxiety and all those feelings. I mean, if we lead a healthier lifestyle and we increase that mind-body connection, then you do lead a more resilient type lifestyle. I know myself, I'm up at 5:15 every morning on that treadmill trying to get my day started, because those endorphins are then released and I'm able to be calmer at my day at work. And doing that for myself has really kind of helped me build a more resilient type of attitude, both at work and at home.
And it's really a very positive spiral. And I'm glad that Nadine, you mentioned gut health, because as we have, better gut health, it really does change the way we think and the way that we feel. And as we think and feel better, we tend to have better lifestyles. It cuts down cortisol. So not only do we feel less stressed, but we actually start losing weight when we start paying attention to the mind body, because we're not jumping into fight or flight all of the time, releasing cortisol, which builds up belly fat, because that's what we do. So that mind body connection is absolutely critical.
And
Okay.
not to mention an additional hobby, you could just add exercising or cooking to kind of relieve your stress as well.
So I have a little self-assessment here. We're not going to run through all of this. I know that for all of you that signed up, you'll be able to sign up for a consultation for your school district and how to move forward with programs for building resiliency. And this is the type of assessment that we do, not just for individuals, but for whole systems, looking at areas of life where you feel most resilient and building on that. We don't have to start from the ground floor. Some people and some systems are pretty healthy and need to go to another level. Where do you feel most vulnerable? What are your weak points? What are those stress points? And how do we move forward? Okay. How do you create a balance between those thought factors, those connections, and interpersonal relationships and physical health to go together? Talking a lot about self-care. And I know that's the buzzword. By the way, self-care is not necessarily doing things that you like to do. It's doing things that you like to do that get you more centered, that get you more focused, that make you more mindful, that make you stronger by doing them. Not necessarily because, oh, that's a cool thing, I like it. And also identifying who your go-to support people are. Who are your connections? Who are your connections in the school? Who are your connections at home? Who are your connections in your community? And how do you use those connections reciprocally? So you help the people who are your connections and your connections help you. So since we've talked about mindfulness as being kind of sitting underneath everything, let's just take a very, very quick poll here. I think that's poll 4.
You have poll 3 up. You look at poll 4.
So have you been practicing the mindfulness over the last few weeks? And here's a good one. How's it been going? Has it been helpful? No benefits? Well, this is just silly. I don't have time for this mindfulness stuff. I love this runaway train that I'm seeing here. Okay, we're gonna cut this short only because I can leave it open a little bit more, but it's very, very clear that most of you are already practicing some mindfulness and building mindfulness into your personal care practice. And that you're finding it helpful. And that's great. And it's a great step to start building resiliency. So I also want to just pivot here for a second, talk a little bit about burnout. Nadine, you want to talk about burnout?
I mean, I have teachers that are coming in and out of my office all day long because of what's going on. And they're feeling it's the physical and emotional exhaustion of everything that's being piled upon them. It's having 35 students in their class when they should only have 23 students and keeping them equally spaced out. It's the parents that are calling them and not doing or having a difficult time at home. It's the physical ailments such as headaches or the difficulty sleeping at night because your brain is trying to process what just took place during the day. And it's that loss of compassion that you're feeling. And that's what we're going to talk about in a little bit. But it's that you're hearing it over and over again about what's going on and the family members. You have kids who are not having birthday parties and the same complaints and the same situations. And we're all going through it. but almost how many times can you hear the same story? And then at one point you just kind of become stoic and you just lose all motivation and enthusiasm for anything that you used to once enjoy. And it's happening. It's happening here. I mean, there are teachers that will say to me often that they cannot be a teacher anymore. The teaching is so scripted, and their day to day is so scripted now because of everything that's going on, that they no longer have their own personal abilities to make the classroom their own. So some things that cause burnout and what we're seeing are basically a lack of control over the tasks that you have. And that's what's happening with everything in the world. We don't know what's going on. I don't even know if the federal the government knows what's really going on right now. And they're trying to decipher through it. But while they're trying to figure it through, it's all kind of following on us. We just in New York State lowered our quarantine to 5 days after it was 10 days. And we're confused on who that applies to, front runners, not front runners. It's all unclear job requirements, the negative and unsupportive work environment, the political climate. Again, like I said earlier, the conversations that take place in school districts are just very different. No longer are we asking how your child is. No longer are we asking how you're doing with so-and-so. We're not remembering that your father may have been sick or that somebody may have been, because we've kind of lost that empathy because we ourselves, not because we are not nice people, it's just because we ourselves are feeling such amount of burnout.
Okay, and I also just want to talk about two important related ideas to burnout, and one is moral injury. And educators feel this all the time. And moral injury is when you're put into a position where you're being asked to do things that either contradict your moral values, you know what's right, you know what you should be doing, but you're asked to do it anyway. And now you have to weigh this out. Do I want to still teach? Am I, do I feel comfortable with this? And moral injury can actually lead to quicker burnout. The thing about moral injury is that once you feel moral injury, it's hard to unfeel it. And that relates over to compassion fatigue, that we're asked to give so much of ourselves that our tank is just empty. And we see this in all sorts of caring positions, that we just have so much emotional strain. There's not a whole lot left of us to give. And the most important thing to recognize is that when you have compassion fatigue, not only might you be short with your students and you might be short with your family, but the compassion that you've given to everybody and now you're out of, that means that you're not demonstrating any self-compassion and you're not giving yourself a break. And when you start filling up your strength to start showing compassion again, you're still not showing self-compassion, setting up high standards, setting up expectations that are so out of your reach because they're just impossible, that you begin to start burning out all over again. So as you go through compassion fatigue, the first person who should start getting some of that compassion back is yourself. So let's talk a little bit about what we can do in strategies for thoughts, connections, and physicality. So, Nadine,
so talk all about resilience here, Paul, and now, like, how do the people who are attending, what can we offer to them? How can we help? What's going on for these educators? How can we build it? How can we build resilience? And I know that
okay, and there are lots of ways. Practicing self-care, I had just mentioned, could be anything, but it has to be something that's meaningful to you. So music, reading. I saw somebody who was a yoga instructor there. Namaste. So that's important. Spending time with loved ones that we care about. Yes, I ride a motorcycle, and that's very centering to me. And a number of years ago, Nadine and I formed a team in obstacle course racing. So this is a picture of us from a Spartan run at City Field. It's centering, it's focusing, it's invigorating, it builds up that kind of sense of resilience. Setting emotional boundaries. You don't have to be all things to all people. You can only go so far with your students. You can only go so far with your neighbors. You have to know what those boundaries are. Cutting back and prioritizing responsibilities. This is Warren Buffett. one of the richest people in the country, one of the richest people in the world. And he has a great quote here that says, very successful people say no to almost everything. And the thing is that what he says yes to, he jumps in 1,000%, but he doesn't jump into everything. In fact, he jumps into the things that he knows are meaningful to him and the things that he can contribute to. We have to learn to say no a little bit more. Scheduling time and giving us breaks. Everybody talks about multitasking also. And the idea of multitasking is great, but not if there are too many tasks. So let's go back to our friend Warren Buffett. If you have a limited number of tasks, then multitask them. But don't think that you should multitask everything, because that's just too much. I want to jump, because we're just about out of time, to these last two. Starting the day with intention, going back to my yoga instructor, and starting the day with a toodle. And let me talk about these real fast. Starting the day with a toodle changes your lens. Wake up, look at the person, that you see first. Doesn't matter if it's a partner. It doesn't matter if it's a kid. Doesn't matter if it's your barista. And let out a toodle. Get into your school building and toodle somebody. It doesn't have to be a public proclamation, but it has to be a statement of gratitude and positivity. So now that you're refocused on the gratitude. The other thing is to start your day with an intention. And the intention doesn't have to be big and broad. It doesn't have to be, today I'm going to be more resilient. That might be a little too much. It could be, today I'm going to meet one new person. Today I'm going to make one person laugh. Today I'm going to, give one extra toodle to somebody else. Intend to do something that's positive, that moves you forward. Then you're thinking about it and it's front and center. Then you start following it up with behaviors. So we thank you, and our takeaways. Nadine, do you want to have a little takeaway for yourself?
Yeah, so there's me right there with the goat, practicing some goat yoga myself over there with my daughter next to me. But some takeaways just for me is, that again, you start the day in a positive and you look for some way to focus on the good and find some things that you enjoy. And it's important to go back to your roots and go back to some things that you previously once enjoyed, and remember who you are and remember what you're capable of. And you guys are heroes and you are superheroes by being the educators that you are. And we've lost sight of that. And we have to kind of go back to our original roots and really build up our resiliency. And by doing that, finding ourselves again.
And, when Nadine sent me that picture over, that photo over, I just smiled from ear to ear, not only because it's a great photo, but it shows all of these pieces, connections with the people that she cares about, her and her daughter. It talks about thoughtfulness and mindfulness and being present, even with a goat on her back, and the physicality of practicing yoga. That's exactly what bringing thoughts, bringing connections, and bringing physicality together looks like. That's a picture of all three pillars in one place. Great. Absolutely great. My photo is just a good way to end. And I want to let you know that the light in me sees, acknowledges, and does honor the light in you for all that you do as educators. I know that you share that light with all of your students, and I'm absolutely gracious that you're doing it, and that I hope you find more light for yourself, because you deserve it. Namaste.
I have my mom on my.
I saw that.
I know she came and I forwarded her the link from my. It's Just Us, right?
I don't know who's still on. Let me end. And I'll call.